our first speaker, Damien Jennings, is going to talk to us about competition law and sporting leagues. And I was thinking when I last coached at the last session, I last coached was some 20 years ago, and we had a very rugby team in Adelaide, so same area. We had a wonderful Fijian player who played for $400 a week. Now, 20 years ago, $400. I don't know how we would fare.
Yeah,
perhaps you'll
bit higher, I reckon. Thanks, Jim. Firstly, thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to present on this topic. I'm a non-lawyer. My background is in sports administration, but I suppose the changing dynamic of the industry, commercialisation, has highlighted the need to understand the law in that if you're working in that area. The flow-down impacts of things that have happened at a professional level and how they're now impacting on community-based sport. This issue in particular, Jim just spoke about $400 back 20 years ago for a player to undertake a recreational hobby. So you might train once or twice a week, then play on a Saturday or Sunday. This issue seen the same example that players were getting $1,500, $2,000. They'd train 1 or 2 nights a week, then they'd get paid $2,000 to go play on a Saturday. So sport has moved away from purely being that recreational activity or a hobby, and the desire to win is there in the community just as it's at a professional level. The desire to win are the same, but the economics and the frameworks are slightly different. So this presentation is a case study of that issue and the response that a governing body put in place, a labour market control mechanism that a governing body put in place to try and minimise those issues and control what was happening. I acknowledge that the views in this presentation are my own and not necessarily those of my employer, and I say that because my employer which is the government, is a large funder of this body. That I'll present through. So the views are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect those of the government. And this presentation isn't designed to be critical of what's been implemented. It's using law as a framework to look at the issue of community sport and labour market more holistically. So to give you some idea what we're talking about and the sport. So we're talking about Australian rules football, not other varieties, not the round ball game, and to give you the structure of football in South Australia. So at the top of the pyramid, you see the AFL. Below that is the SANFL, which is a governing body for football, Australian rules in South Australia. Equivalent in other states, predominantly under the AFL's control. It's set for the WAFL. So South Australia and the WAFL are probably those two. It's still independent organisations at a state level that don't fall under the AFL's banner in that respect, even though they abide by codes of conduct in there. So the SANFL is the largest state sporting organisation in South Australia by far. It's important because it runs a competition which is comparable to, if you're here, comparable to the NEFL, comparable to the Victorian Football League. It's the next level down from the AFL. And it's not just that competition though that the governing body looks after. The governing body also looks after junior competitions, pathways, talent ID pathways, umpiring. And to the side of that, they have another arm. Formerly, where you see Community Football League sit now it's in that alignment in-house. Before, the Community Football League used to operate as a licence agreement by the SANFL, so they had their own separate board. Now, as of this year, they've come in-house, so they're just a subcommittee of the SANFL Football Commission. You'll see there how big the South Australian Community Football League is. So outside of the SANFL, which is a step down from the AFL, it covers everything outside of that. So you're looking at one Metro League, which is an open league in terms of promotion and relegation, and 25 regional leagues that cover the size of South Australia. So South Australia is a pretty big place in terms of geography. It's quite big. So you're looking at 190 clubs you're looking at 25,000, above 25,000 registered players. Not all of those players would receive payment. It's also important to note that to progress to the AFL, it's difficult to progress from the South Australian Community Football League to the AFL. So the best way to progress to the AFL, if you're going to pursue a professional career, is if you're in the SANFL or you sat within one of those junior pathway, elite talent pathway. So it is possible if you progress from the Community Football League to the AFL, but it's not as easy as if you sat in the other. So player payments was seen to, the desire to win drove up player payments. So we're talking about community. This morning we heard about the construct of community clubs, how important they are to communities, ran by volunteers, what they mean to people, how they bring people together. And winning is part of that. People think if you win, you become closer together. It's also about bragging rights. Community football is about, particularly in regional areas, is about beating that town next to you. You want to. It's like a showdown, whether the Crows are playing Power or Fremantle's playing West Coast. It's your local derby when you're playing against those teams. So the desire to win and having no control over wages and players being able to shop themselves around meant that clubs were spending more and more to engage playing talent. And these players they might be ex-AFL players in some cases or ex-AFL players. So, and they set their prices. They said, well, we'll come for this much, and we're able to, and clubs wanted to pay that because they wanted to win. And it got to a point where the clubs decided and the governing body decided we need to put something in place to kind of control what's happening. And these issues, in no particular order, were identified when they asked them what were the issues with these rising player payments, what were the issues. They talked about financial strain there, competitive balance, inability to compete with that neighbour. So they want those bragging rights. If the other team was paying more, they couldn't compete with them and they had the bragging rights. So they wanted to shift that. And also competitiveness between the leagues. So that's about geography. When associations come together and compete against each other, the players, because travel's a major issue, the players might not travel further. They'll choose to travel to those leagues that are closer to Adelaide. So the best playing talent moved to those leagues. So when they played intra-association games, those leagues would dominate those ones that were further away from the metro base. Volunteer strain and retention. Clubs, because they lifted how much they were spending, clubs felt like they had to fundraise more, they had to put on more events, and so that was one of their issues. They felt like there was a desire where in sporting clubs, in community clubs, your income streams are limited. Memberships, some sponsorships. You don't have broadcasting rights, you don't have these diverse range of revenue streams, so the money comes from your volunteers. Facility development neglect. So clubs were choosing to put monies into their playing talent rather than developing their facilities. On that, I would think that regardless of whatever sport it is and regardless whether they pay players or not, I think sporting clubs don't necessarily maintain their facilities to the best manner anyway. So when we're looking at the issues here, I think the issues up the top are probably more prevalent to the ones listed down the below. So the ones those bottom three are consistent, no matter whether you're playing players or not. And negative media was this become an issue, and they felt like football was getting a bad rap throughout the communities, and because football holds such an important position in the cultural landscape, they thought football was getting a bad rap. So, like I said, I'll focus on those top three because I think they have more weight than what the bottom three issues identified do. So the response. So they surveyed their clubs and asked their clubs what they wish to implement. And they also asked them how much they spent. So there was a number of clubs that spent $100,000 or above. You're talking about a 16-week season. you're talking about not every player will be getting paid. So those players would be local players, and the players coming in that might be based in metro areas and the other ones getting played. They already had an existing approved player point system in place, which is a labour market control in itself. So every player had a figure attached to them based on their experience and skill. So they might have 10 points, and if you played SANFL, you have a 3 points attached to you, and you can't go over that 10 points. So you could look at that in isolation and consider whether that is a restraint. You can find that in some professional leagues around the world, and in Australia. The NBL, for example, used to have an improved player point system. And so it was decided that based on the feedback that they wanted to keep that to try and control and distribute the playing talent, but then they wanted to add to it to try and address some of those issues I previously identified. So this is what they decided to put in place. So they put in place a marquee player, only one player per week. That is your marquee for the whole year, unless you terminate, and then they get paid a maximum $1,000 per week. So if you take the figures that they were previously earning, that could be a considerable drop in what they're earning. And then the next player that you pay on your team cannot earn more than $500 per week. So if you had two players previously that earned $1,200 in 2015, in 2016, only one of them could get $1,000 and the second one had to get $500. Yeah. And then the bottom one is a salary cap as such that every week the club can only spend a maximum of $4,000. This caused quite conjecture when they were implementing the policy, the labour market control. And you couldn't say spend $2,000 one week and then say, I've kept $2,000 in the bank, and then when it comes to finals time, spend the extra money. So they put that in place. And they had to, after much discussion, they had to adjust that bottom one, and then they had to sort of phase it in, because originally they had it at $3,000, but clubs were already committed to contracts. So players were already committed to contracts, so they had to phase it in. So it went up to 4, but this year obviously they're dropping. Started at 3, they agreed to 4, and now they're coming back to 3,500 this year, and then next year it's going to be 3 flat. So there's a number of issues here. While they were trying to implement this policy, a number of one association particularly said they weren't going to do it. They said, we're choosing not to disaffiliate, but we're choosing not to implement your labour market control, because they believe that they're operating within their means. If you agree to affiliate, you agree to be bound by the rules of the governing body. So at the end of obviously they realised that, and then they had to agree to the mechanism. But they could have chose to disaffiliate and ran their own competition, but then they wouldn't have the benefits of affiliation. They wouldn't have that alignment in structure that we've discussed, has been mentioned a number of times today. But it needed to be, for it to work, it needed to be everybody in, like the whole South Australia had to be in within the system. Serie A, for example, football in Italy, the difficulties of wage restraints there. Some years ago, Serie B tried to implement a salary cap there. And if you understand football and the way the players move and the wages, that it's just unrealistic because of player movement. So similar premise. So what fits within that 4,000? What payments are included? So you'll see there it's quite extensive, and if you had a few players, that you hit the $4,000 quite quick. So payments under contract. If you were in 2 hours from Adelaide and the player needed to come up and stay, and you paid for his room that night, that's included as well. Best and fairest incentives. Player coaches, they had to cover that, because if you can be obviously a player and a coach, but if you could just say, oh, I'm just coaching, I'll get $20,000 for coaching and just play, and then you wouldn't be included in the cap, so they had to be there. Superannuation. So that's highlighting that sports moved away from for many community clubs, has just moved away from a recreation or a hobby. So any payments that go above the 9.5% are included in this. Fringe benefits tax. And then they remove sign-on fees as well. So no clubs can pay sign-on fees. So that was a way to community clubs use sign-on fees to encourage players to join their club, that incentive. So and then it became a checkbook, like a rat race. Who could bid the most money for the players? So these players, they're community footballers, they would do up resumes and send out resumes to community clubs and say, this is how many years I've played, this is my experience. If I'm a forward, I kicked 100 goals in 2015 and my team won the premiership. So they'd sell themselves. So it just shows you how the environment within community sport has changed. So there are similar sports that have similar issues like this in South Australia. So every player that's paid must sign a standard playing contract. And payment could be not just for playing, even if they paid them for their travel, they had to abide by this contract. They had to sign this contract. So they're individually negotiated, these contracts, by the player. Obviously there's no players association, there's no collective bargaining. They're individually negotiated. And it highlights the control that these clubs have over the players in which they play. So you talk about being like you would do in a workplace, being in the best possible condition to perform your duties, uniforms, attending particular functions, and then being responsible to the directions of the senior coach, president or secretary. So this issue for me came about when I had a number of people contacted me, both through my employment or outside of. I grew up in regional areas, so football club is central to my upbringing, and that's why this interests me. And so people would say, well, they're restricting what I do. Where do I go? What are my response? My earnings I use that earnings to help build my shed or helped pay for my wedding. It's been split in half. What can I do? I have to agree to all these things, and that's where I suppose using the law provided the framework to look at the issue holistically and not just think, I suppose, both from a governing bodies and an individual's perspective, to just when you implement regulations, you just cannot think that they're going to respond and address the issues that have been identified. There needs to be, I suppose, some data and evidence there, and that you either build that over time or you use that to determine your decision going forward. And that's when we started looking at the common law and restraint of trade, and these principles are relatively settled, both in Australia and internationally, and highlighted that it's relevant to transfer systems, internal draft zoning regulations that have been challenged in the past, and disciplinary proceedings. I suppose at a professional level, through collective bargaining, the application of this instrument has become less useful in some respect, because the clubs have a voice, the players have a voice, and are able to mutually agree to some things. So to test this, in Nordenfelt there, it's relatively settled on how you determine whether there is a restraint and whether that restraint is valid. So all organisations that implement such restraints must show that they're necessary to protect their legitimate objectives. So for a governing body such as the one we've discussed, it's about financial stability of clubs. It's about competition balance. It's about sustainability of clubs within communities. And then you have to balance that up against whether the restraint is reasonable, and whether it's in the, and then whether, as it's linked as well, whether it's in the public interest. So desirability for competitive balance. that was on one of the earlier slides. That was one of the reasons why people wanted this introduced. So it's well established that competitive balance isn't a legitimate objective for sporting organisations, found both there in that Eastern case in English soccer and also Buckling and Tuddy in New South Wales internal draft case. It's based on the uncertainty of outcomes, that not the one team would win all the time, that if one team wins all the time, gate receipts decrease, sponsorship decrease, attendances decrease, television viewers decrease. So it's about competition creates interest. Obviously the economics, it's an economic discussion, and the economics of professional sport are slightly different to that of, why comparable in some respects, are different to that of a community-based sporting league. So community sport doesn't compete with for fans like a professional league does. So for example, Gold Coast and Brisbane Lions compete for members. If I'm living in the Barossa Valley in South Australia and I'm a football club, I'm not competing with the Clare Valley for members, because people aren't gonna, you support where you live. It's not like if I live in Adelaide and go for West Coast. Like you can do that happens in professional sport. In community sport, it doesn't occur like that. So one of the questions is, are those justifications in professional sport relevant to community sport? And even if competition is uneven, you have one or two dominate, will sponsors drop off in community sport because their team isn't winning, or do sponsors sponsor for other reasons? Like, so the pub sponsors the local football club because he knows that at the end of the day he'll hold the function at the night, and he knows there'll be 200 people come back and spend money over the bar and buy dinners. So will revenue decrease? So financial sustainability was also seen as a reason, and we talked about there, and one of the justifications was that they would be more financially stable as a result of the regulations. As in that case cited there, it was proven that without data, that's not a sound justification. Appropriateness of revenue distribution schemes. In community sport in particular, if you're a volunteer and you put in effort, you don't want to see that money, you're not going to put in that effort if that money is then given to the club next door. And also, if one thing they could have made worth considering, if they introduced the cap and they allowed a club to overspend, whatever that club overspent by, that money could be divided across the other clubs within the league. So by overspending, they're also they're shifting funds into the other clubs, which allows them to invest in more playing talent, which then could bring them comparable. But when you talk about financials of community clubs, you can't underestimate the importance of sound governance practices. For example, we receive a number of grant applications in my job for different things, and one of the applications highlighted that a regional football club that is subject to this lost $35,000 because the treasurer skipped away with it. So you've got to look at those sort of issues, and that's when we talk about looking at regulations holistically, and that this isn't a silver bullet in terms of, and that a governing body needs to look to address those other issues as well. And that's maybe, if that's where the data comes from as well. If you addressed the governance issues beforehand, would you need a market restraint, labour control? So public interest of community football clubs, we've touched on this, and this has been highlighted throughout the day. I think these things are well understood. But geography is a particular issue, tyranny of distance, but also demographics. Young people moving to metro for employment opportunities. So that forced the clubs to buy talent in, because they simply believed that they couldn't field a team if they didn't. So looked at the common law, but quickly onto the whether they could pursue action under the Competition and Consumer Act. The governing body is a trading corporation. They generate revenue. you could establish that a club-to-player market existed, like they did in Adamson and West Perth, where Brian Adamson was a player in the Waffle when he wanted to transfer to Norwood. But they tried to establish that the clubs also competed for sponsors and members, and they found that wasn't the case. But a club-to-player market did exist. And then the final one there, and that goes back to the standard playing contract, is that players that get paid, they establish a contract of service between there. So a player who liked to pursue this couldn't do so under that because they wouldn't be able to jump that hurdle as Gary Bacanara couldn't, or as Brian Anderson couldn't. And then just as a comparative measure, and I suppose both from the philosophical implementation and the reasons for it, we did a brief comparison between that and UEFA financial fair play. So one of the issues in European football was that people were buying success. So Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, Man City owners, PSG. So you'd have people outside of the sport coming in and buying success. So a similar thing here, where they thought a local farmer was coming in and putting money into the club to buy success, or the local publican was. So similar thing, and the need to make more sustainable clubs and that control their finances. But I suppose UEFA phased in their regulations, but also have produced data going forward, and I suppose, and that's been legally challenged and will probably continue to be. So just quickly in closing, so playing community sport can no longer be seen as just a recreation or a hobby. It's commercialisation and people's desire to win for some has moved away, and that has implications not just here but in other aspects of the law. So these clubs have gone away from being purely volunteers to now having employees as such. So you talk about things like work health and safety and legislation and that. So there's a whole range of areas. So, and governing bodies need to understand this. Governing bodies, particularly at a state level, are insular environments. And I've worked in a sporting organisation as well at a state level, so I understand is you're not great at looking more broadly. You focus on that internal environment, but the answers, or some think to help justify your work and to support your work, can be found more broadly. So in this case, the law provides a framework to highlight the issue on a holistic manner. For the clubs, a phased-in approach would have been beneficial because they're already obligated to certain things, and obviously the enforcement of this and the compliance of this is quite difficult. They have zone registers set up to track these contracts. They have an integrity officer that we helped put in place, but the original remit of that position wasn't designed to cover this, but this has become an issue where it does cover this. So it's interesting how the landscape of community football and community sport has changed, and that cascading effect. So I think I get your time. So thank you.
We'll have a discussion for 5 minutes, but we're breaking between papers so that if you wish to alter where you're sitting, we'll break in 5. But let's, for 5 minutes, have a discussion, some questions. I myself take a fairly liberal view. I don't believe salary caps work anyway. They don't seem to produce in Europe, for example, the sort of things that we hope for here, or in the US where they got soft caps. Yeah. So why are we worrying about this? Another layer of regulation. Yeah. The market sort of deals with it. That's my $400 Fijian player for the University of Adelaide was money well spent for a variety of reasons. It wasn't just that we were buying success, but it's the flat playing field. Does it work for that? Well, Leicester City, they didn't have expensive players and they had that glorious success. Yeah. What do you think? Any questions?
I had a question about how it was policed, and you touched on it at the end that there was a zone registrar.
Yeah. So
how does that work?
So all contracts, every region has a zone register, which is a designated person, and all contracts must be submitted to that zone register, and then they collate all the information and then send that to the governing body.
So every player signs...
Every player that's paid signs that standard playing contract.
And do they declare that that's true and correct?
Yeah. And obviously on top of that playing contract, they sign a membership to that club that binds them to the other policies and that throughout. the game.
What's the major method of policing that with the clubs? That's always an issue.
Yeah, so
you have complete oversight of their financials.
Yeah, trust.
Okay.
That'll work.
Paul.
Yeah, sorry, I've got a comment as well around the policing side of it. So WA is very similar to South Australia. I'll put my hand up. I played in the Waffle and I was getting paid. It was fine, contracts fine. I start playing in the country league and it's all cash.
Yeah.
And they're bringing in this year, so I've been told, hey, we can't pay you this big amount of money anymore. We have to pay you $500,
Yeah.
which means great.
Yeah.
Right? But the policing of it, when a lot of the clubs are still crafty, so it'll be on the books of 500, but
Yeah, and that's right.
Cover your ears.
yeah.
And
I'm just wondering, like, because it's been happening for so long, and in terms of having the impact, how it's, I think more needs to go into the policing if they're serious, because I know in WA we've got 200 plus clubs, and they're talking about one integrity officer who's going to go to clubs and make sure the books are.
Yeah, I agree that there probably needs more investment in policing, but even if you have the cap, people always try, and it doesn't mean that clubs will abide by the cap. So are you still achieving your objectives of implementing the regulations? There's a lot to it, and that highlights the changing environment of a state sporting organisation compared to at a national level. You work in the AFL Integrity Department, you've got abundance of resources to police this type of issues. And when the regulations were first designed, that integrity officer position wasn't developed. So as good fortune, that position come about. But they also have a subcommittee, also a panel that addresses those. So there's another layer of governance there, and then they also have some independents that can do, if the integrity officer wasn't in place, they'd be able to engage independents to do that work. But obviously that's regardless of what sport you're in or where you sit. I think enforcement and compliance is an issue of labour market controls of this nature.
I would say, firstly, I think Leicester City is remarkable because of its unusual. But the financial fair play is a very different thing, I think, in that it's quite a cynical exercise. It's kind of designed to keep the top clubs.
That's right. It's not competitive balance.
Kind of almost the opposite of what this is trying to do.
Yeah, I think this is trying to do both. So they want competitive balance, then they want that financial side as well. Whereas I suppose, in European football, you're not going to achieve competitive balance, and you would argue that financial fair play has...
It's based on turnover of clubs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you've got a lot of money to start with, you do well.
Yeah.
And it kind of almost entrenches
similar thing. So the clubs with the most turnover, with the most sponsorship, were able to spend the most money.
Or sell their own naming rights of their own stadiums themselves.
Couldn't do that here. Yeah.
What about restraint of trade? I think there's a good case for restraint of trade here that
Yeah.
be successful. The lawyers amongst us could have that and bring that, and I think it would be shut, don't you think?
Yeah, and on top of that, an interesting one of those leagues identified the Metro League there. So they wanted to actually, the story was they wanted to introduce regulations that if a player left that Metro League to one of those country leagues to chase money, that they were going to prevent them from coming back. So, but then that would have, whether they could do that, because that would have been against their affiliation agreement with the governing body. So there's another restriction there. So, and that's I suppose that's a football politics at a state level.